but we really didn't mention or respond to probably a question many of us thought about along the way. We're always talking about using glucose, but what about everything else that we eat, right? So I thought it would be helpful or handy to include this diagram that really does show, try to help us see where do the other macromolecules that we eat in our foods, where do they go? Because some of them do contain energy for us to use, right? Most notably, we know fats are long-term storage. So where do those enter into our aerobic respiration picture? All right, so rest assured that what you eat, the major bits that make those things you eat up, the carbohydrates, the fats, the proteins, they can all be used, but they just get introduced into the cell respiration process at some different stage. For example, the alcoholic-like fats, the glycerols, will actually enter into glycolysis and be converted from that point on into cell respiration, right, into aerobic respiration. The fatty acids, saturated and unsaturated fats, they'll actually go right to the acetyl coenzyme A within the matrix of the mitochondria and enter the system at that point on. Proteins, as you can see with the purple arrow leaders, they can enter at various points in cell respiration. They can show up and be used in glycolysis to make pyruvate. They can be used in acetyl coenzyme A process, or they could be delivered right to the Krebs cycle. We also then use proteins. We break them down into the monomers, those amino acids or amino groups, to be used for other things. But anyway, just so you're aware that each of these can be converted into some molecule that can be used either in glycolysis or someplace in the mitochondria as we finish aerobic respiration. All right, so what if we don't have oxygen? There are two scenarios that will play out. Right? One, you die. Okay? If you don't have oxygen, the electron transport chain can't unload those electrons. Everything backs up. That means even the NADH that we make in glycolysis can't unload its electrons. There's only so many NAD plus to go around. So we're stuck. It's traffic jam, right? So no ATP gets made. Or we can use anaerobic respiration. I prefer to use anaerobic respiration to buy us some time to find some oxygen. Yeah. So let's prefer living than not. All right. So we know that anaerobic respiration will kick in when oxygen is not available in good enough supply. Glycolysis will still happen first, so we still have that two-phase process where we load in two ATPs and we break glucose down into two pyruvate molecules, and in doing that, we get 4 ATP and a couple NADHs. So that's going to happen. But this will be followed by a second step known as fermentation. And what fermentation does is it does not give us any extra ATP, right? So don't be misled by the statement that it yields a net gain of 2 ATP. What we're talking about is the 2 ATP that we gain is from the glycolysis step, right? But what it allows us to do then is offload those electrons off of NADH. So now we have NAD plus ready to go again to break down more glucose, to make more ATP for us. Right? The final electron acceptor then becomes that pyruvate, and we need to regen NAD plus to help continue the cycle. Right? If you did your flow chart diagram for aerobic respiration, the first stage, that glycolysis step, it's very evident that you need NAD plus to move forward. If NAD plus is not there, you cannot move forward. If oxygen is not there to unload electrons in the mitochondria, everything else backs up. The NADH can't unload, the FADH2 can't unload, which means Krebs cycle shuts down, which means we're stuck all the way back in glycolysis land. Right? And so we need another path to unload these electrons to. All right, so there are two major types of fermentation. Right? The first, alcoholic fermentation. This is done by some bacteria and most notably the single-celled fungus known as yeast. The other type of fermentation is lactic acid fermentation. This is what we go through, our cats, dogs, most animals, and some bacteria also will go through this too. Now, both processes do the same, have the same end game. Right? They both will try to free up NAD+, so we can break down more glucose. It's showing us the net events of alcoholic fermentation. So this is going on in yeast and other bacteria. Glucose is ran through glycolysis just like before. We gain a total of 2 ATPs total. We convert and add energy electrons to NADH. Right? So that happens. And we make those couple of pyruvic acid molecules, or 2 pyruvates. Oxygen is not present to offload the NADH. So we're stuck unless we go through alcoholic fermentation in the yeast or some bacteria here. So how do we unload them? Well, we convert these pyruvate molecules into ethanol or ethyl alcohol. Along this process, we're going to release a couple carbon dioxides. So we go from a couple 3-carbon molecules in pyruvate to a couple 2 carbons in ethyl alcohol. In fact, the term ethyl, or the reason it has eth on the front of its name, is because in organic chemistry, eth means 2 carbons. So ethanol is a 2-carbon alcohol. Methanol, meth means 1 carbon. So that's methyl alcohol, or methanol would be a 1-carbon alcohol. What also is the most beneficial though here is that we actually get NAD+ back. And if we do, then that means that guy can be recycled back to the front end of our process, and we can break down more glucose. We can make more ATP. And we're not even using oxygen to do it. Now, because we are producing carbon dioxide, people will use yeast to help with the cakes and breads and stuff, because we put it in our dough mix. As it goes through its fermentation, it generates carbon dioxide, little bubbles, little pockets of carbon dioxide get stuck in that dough and cause it to rise. Then we bake it, which kills the yeast, and we bread. We also can use this for alcoholic beverages because we're producing ethanol, which is also known as just simply as alcohol. So yeast can then be fermented, can go through fermentation inside a closed container. And if you don't let that pressure out, that carbon dioxide out, it'll start to diffuse into the liquid that's in there as well, and it'll carbonate it. So you'll have this carbonated alcoholic beverage, like beer. If you leave it open to the atmosphere, or you control a release of the pressure, then you do not carbonate the alcohol you're making, and it's usually used in wine making processes. Right? So who knew, right? Very, very helpful. So thankfully, we go through lactic acid fermentation, right? Thankfully, we go through that. All right, so the difference is, well, there's not a whole lot of difference other than we're going to produce lactic acid. We will free up NAD+, which is, again, helping us break down more glucose. But the side effect is, as that builds up in our muscle tissues, or where we use anaerobic respiration in a high degree, it's going to start causing those muscle pains, the burning sensation, which forces us to slow down. And we slow down so that way our body can recover and get the oxygen it needs to help break down not only the lactic acid we produced, but also to help fuel respiration to make more ATP. So who knew, right? Who knew? You guys know now. So how is this different than alcoholic fermentation? Not much difference. We're still going to see glycolysis happen, so the same beginning to our flow chart. Still will produce 2 ATP altogether, 2 loaded in to make it start, 4 produced at the end, a total gain of 2 ATP. We use up a couple NADHs, and we make our couple pyruvates. All right, nothing different. Here's where it's different for our own cells. Right? We will produce from pyruvate, we'll make lactic acid. Notice that we have a 3-carbon molecule here. We have a 3-carbon molecule in lactate or lactic acid also. So we do not give off carbon dioxide. convert the NADHs back into NAD plus to be cycled back so we can break down more glucose without the use of oxygen. This lasts for very short periods of time. Our ATP that we have in our bodies will only last a few seconds. And then from what anaerobic respiration can produce, we can run on anaerobic respiration for maybe a minute to a minute and a half. So this oxygen debt is caused by this lactic acid fermentation, and that's why you breathe more heavily after you do some sort of activity. And your respiration rate will go up the more things that you're doing to try to keep the oxygen levels up and move through aerobic respiration. So not too bad. Fermentation, two similar processes. Alcoholic fermentation, yeast and some bacteria. Lactic acid fermentation for everything else. Okay, so there are two types of skeletal muscle then that we'll see kind of our body develop or build in based on the activities that we do. The red type of muscle, or red muscle, has a higher blood supply. It's going to have more mitochondria per cell than other muscle cells, and it's meant for like longer, strenuous exercise. But they're going to run primarily off of aerobic respiration. So they're going to pick a pace and be able to run at that nice, steady, even rate for long periods of time. Your body, as you train and exercise, will naturally try to build in more mitochondria into those muscle cells for longer endurance races or runs or exercise. And so what does that let you do? That lets you be a lot more efficient at taking oxygen and converting it into ATP and in a shorter period of time. Those people who are sprinters are going to have more of what they call white muscle or fast twitch muscle fibers. They're more like white in appearance because the blood flow is not as much as other muscle tissue. It's going to have fewer mitochondria because they're going to function on mainly anaerobic respiration. Right? So they'll be good for delivering what they have from their ATP reserve plus what they get from anaerobic respiration before their lactic acid threshold is hit. Right? Sprinters will have more of these because they're going to dump all of their energy in the first 90 seconds of their event or less. Right? And then they'll be bent over panting and trying to recover their oxygen debt afterwards. So it's kind of interesting to look at. So if you were to enter into a race, how does your body deal with that? First, your body's going to use the stored ATP. It's only good for a couple seconds, and then you're out. Second thing your body will do is it's going to start to produce ATP through lactic acid fermentation. So it's going to go through that anaerobic process. That's going to give you energy to sustain that higher pace or that quicker pace at the start of your run for about 90 seconds or so. After which, you'll get slower and slower and slower. Anything over 90 seconds, your body must use cell respiration through aerobic processes. Right, at the end of your note set, there's a table. The table is going to ask you to differentiate between photosynthesis and cell respiration. You should take some time and make sure you can complete that table, knowing the differences between the two. Right, but just keep in mind that all animals, every living organism, has to go through cell respiration. Right, there's a select special few, like the autotrophs, like plants, that can actually make their own sugar, their own energy molecules from inorganic things. We can't do that. We get to eat them.